Hello, everyone. Um, my name is Selim Kuru, and I am an associate professor and chair of the Near Eastern Languages and Civilization Department. And I am the director of Persian and Iranian Studies, interim director. Okay. Um, I would like to thank you for being here. This was a wonderful Seattle day today after snow, rain, cold. This was the payback from the city. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm sure you are going to enjoy tonight a talk by a wonderful scholar, Professor Afshin Marashi. I'm thankful to him for making time for this talk in his very busy schedule. But if it weren't for your support and a generous endowment by the Afrasiabi family, we would, in memory of their father, Hushang Afrasiabi, we won't be able to make this happen. And I am especially honored tonight for having Madame Mihrima Afrasiabi. Thank you for coming here. I'm really touched. I am thankful to you. You know, Persian and Iranian Studies program at the University of Washington is blessed by your love and appreciation and financial support. Every dime you give us turns into gold in the form of excellent instruction, support in wonderful students, and development of understanding. Maybe this is the most important at this time, understanding, mutual understanding through the unique Persian culture and its values. I would like to thank a couple of people and then tell you a bit about our upcoming events. It will take an hour only. And then we can start the program. First of all, I want to thank the UW faculty who has been a major part for the department and particularly certain units like the Middle East Center. We have the director of the center, Arzu Usanlu, Professor Usanlu. MEC Center, Middle East Center has been a blessing on this campus for our programs in Near and Middle Eastern Studies. Also, the former director of Persian and Iranian Studies program, Joel Walker, is here. Where are you, Joel? Yes, over there, from the history department. Joel has been instrumental to make this program go forward. And then we have Arbella Bet-Shlimon, our Middle Eastern historian. We have Jennifer Dubrow from Asian Languages and Literatures, who does Urdu literature. Where is Jennifer? I can't see anyone tonight. I lost everyone. Okay. So we have all these programs. UW is amazing, an amazing center for Near and Middle Eastern studies, and thanks to Persian community, it is becoming one of the leading institutions in the study of Iran and Persian. And again, thanks to you, we are able to realize many events. This year especially has been, there have been so many events that I lost the track of what is going on. I am a bit stupefied. First of all, I don't know if Kiana Ehsani is here or not, but she has been, this is a student in sciences, but she has been organizing two events, regular events. One is Docu Nights, where every first Wednesday of every month, there is a documentary on Iran is shown on this campus. And second event is Shahnameh Reading Group under the guidance of one of the community members, Afshin Sepehri. And they did yesterday, it must be the Sons of Feridun section in Shahnameh. So they are progressing slowly but very strong, yes. Huh? Oh, Zal and Rudabe, it's even better. Yes, but both events now proudly supports, but they wouldn't be possible if the community members and students take part in those. Next week, we have a presentation by Babek Kiavchi, who is here tonight, on Iranian pop music before and after the revolution. And it is a part of the quarterly Persian Studies workshop and it will take place at Denny Hall in the department seminar room. I hope I will see all of you there to listen to, hopefully, Gugush, my favorite, and others I will learn about. And we had, in fact, a musical month we are having. Like, the documentary for this month was about music, and Ali Sametpour thankfully gave a wonderful talk. Some of you were there. In 2 hours, it felt like 5 minutes. It was so good. And in April, we have a new lecture series. That series needs your support. I will tell you how during the reception. But it is we decided to support a young scholar every year in order to get to know about groundbreaking recent research in Persian studies and to introduce our program and help them. And the first scholar is Dr. Kevin Schwartz, and he will be talking. His talk is titled "The Return of the Masters: Connections, Contestations, and the Redrawing of Persian Literary History." It will be an amazing talk, and it is on April 13. I don't see any pens or calendars. Mark that date. I will take attendance. And one of the signature events of this year is in May, and the dates are May 12th and May 13th. Okay, this is very important. In fact, in these 2 days, there will be 3 different parts of one event. Let me define it as this. But 2 of you especially organized for you. On May 12th, Behruz Gamari Tebrizi will give a keynote talk on Iranian Revolution. He published 2 books, but one of them is really amazing. I strongly recommend it. It is called Remembering Akbar. And it is about Iranian Revolution, the earlier days of revolution, about a person. It is semi-autobiographical, and it is a delightful read. I would like to organize a discussion session before the speaker comes here so that we can meet and discuss the book and then hear the speaker talking about it. I will do something about this. And then on May 13th, Ali Sametpour will present the world premiere of Moonrise Ensemble in Town Hall. So I want all of you to be there, okay? And plus, everybody will bring at least 5 other people. Otherwise, you will pay for them. Okay? All in good humor. And this event is organized by Samed Alavi with help from myself. I helped a lot. Inimitable Sherzad Shams, and 3 wonderful graduate students, MA students, Shan Namei. Where are you, Shan? Oh, he is back there with the beard. And Hurrem Fellow Maral Sahib Jame. Where are you, Maral? Oh, she's over there. Don't be shy. Show yourself. You're a student. And Roshan Fellow Solmaz Shakir Fer. They are amazing students. Those 2 events, like the concert and Behruz Gamari Tabrizi's talks, are linked to a conference titled Writing Iranian Revolution, Memory, Testimony, and Time. And it is made possible by a generous donation by the Roshan Heritage Institute. And I am thankful to the organizers of 2015 Gala, who made all these events possible, and especially Joel Walker, who was one of the initiators of it, and the committee for the gala, as well as Ali Afrasiabi for reaching out to the Roshan and made this possible, this support for the conference. And I want you to stay after this for the reception. There is a reception across the hall. I would love to chat with you, and there is really good food, free of charge. If this is with convincing, okay. And these kinds of events don't make themselves. Like, I am thankful to our administrator, wonderful Mr. Patrick Gibbs. And our program coordinator, Rick Aguilar, was very helpful as well. We have a wonderful administrative team at NELC. And also, I am always thankful to Sharon Dana. Where is Sharon? She is over there. The Advancement Office has been great support in all events. And Sharzad Shams, you will be very thankful for delivering the Persian pastries after the reception. And now I would like to invite my dear colleague, brilliant Dr. Samad Alavi of Persian Studies. Samad works on poetry and politics in pre- and post-revolutionary Iran. His scholarship, teaching, and service is indispensable for our department and the University of Washington, as well as Persian Studies. He will introduce you Professor Marashi. Samad.
Thanks everyone for being here tonight. Can I just say that one of the hardest things about my job is that I always have to speak after Professor Kuru, and after he comes and charms everyone, then I have to come in the shadow of Salim as I know him. It would be easier if I just had a dry chair who would, but not charm everyone, but what can I do? Again, thank you for being here, and I'd also like to extend my thanks to the Afrasiabi family for establishing this lectureship that's been going on since 1999. So I've only been here for the last few years of it, but it's really an honor to be part of this community, to see so many people out here on a Saturday night, and to take part in this event that the Afrasiabis have so generously endowed. So thank you. I'm having a hard time finding. Thank you, and thank you, and thank you. It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our guest for tonight. Dr. Afshin Marashi is the Farzaneh Family Chair in Iranian Studies and Associate Professor in the Department of International and Area Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And during the reception, we can all talk about how the University of Oklahoma has quickly become one of the centers, one of the most exciting centers in Iranian studies these days. Dr. Marashi's area of specialization is the cultural and intellectual history of nationalism in 19th and 20th century Iran. He also writes and teaches in the field of comparative nationalism studies. In addition to his teaching and research efforts, Professor Marashi is also the director of Iranian Studies programming in the College of International Studies at Oklahoma University. Dr. Marashi's first book, Nationalizing Iran, Culture, Power, and the State, 1870 to 1940, was published by our very own University of Washington Press here in Seattle in 2008. He has co-edited several important books and journal volumes and has published his original research in edited collections and a number of journals, including Iran Nameh, the International Journal for Middle East Studies, better known as IJMES, Iranian Studies, and the Journal of Persianate Studies, among others. Dr. Marashi received his BA in Political Science from the University of California at Berkeley and his PhD in History from UCLA. And we thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. Marashi.
Well, thank you all for being here. First of all, can everybody hear me? I'd like to thank you all for being here. This is actually only my second time in Seattle, and I think it's my first time on the campus, and obviously this is a great setting to have a university. And I guess I did miss the cherry come back for the cherry blossoms. But I am really honored to be here. I've looked on the list of previous invitees who have given this lecture, and I'm very humbled to be considered by you to be among this list of scholars who have given this talk. I certainly want to thank a number of people, including Samad Alavi. I don't need to tell you that you're very lucky to have Samad as your expert in the field of Persian literature here at UW. We have gotten to know each other a little bit, and we actually have some of the same teachers. So I know how well trained he is, and the work he's doing I think is very interesting. And UW's great tradition of Persian literature great hands with Samad. I also want to thank Salim Kuru for hosting me this morning. We had brunch and we started to talk, and it seemed like we had so much in common that we're already old friends, it looks like. So thank you for that and all the work that you've been doing to build Iranian studies here at UW. I also want to thank Reshad Kasaba. And I guess he's not here, unfortunately he's out of town, but I really do want to thank him because as Samad said, 8 years ago, or I guess it was actually maybe 10 years ago, when I was looking for a publisher for my manuscript, Professor Kasaba, he was very generous in helping me to find a home for the press at UW. So I really feel at home here at UW for that reason as well, and I really want to thank him. So I guess he's not here, but please tell him that I thank him. And of course, I want to thank the Afrasiabi family for all of their generosity in supporting this lecture series. Iranian Studies really is at sort of a crossroads right now. We have a lot of senior faculty who have either already retired or are on the verge of retirement, and we have a new crop of junior scholars who are wanting to contribute to the field. And sometimes it's somewhat difficult to convince university administrators to devote resources to just one country. And so really the private support for Iranian studies is very important, and Samad mentioned what's happening at the University of Oklahoma, which has really grown in the 6 years that I've been there, largely, really entirely through the support of the Farzaneh family of Oklahoma. And in California, there are similar things going on, and I'm glad that there's the beginning of something like that here at UW as well. And I told both Salim and Samad that I'd be able to help in any way I can to help develop it further. In any case, thanks to all the rest of you for being here. And I'm very excited to have this opportunity to share with you some of my work, some of my research. And I'm going to try to speak for about 45 minutes. I'm going to try my best not to try your patience. But what I'd like to do is to present to you in some detail a small part, but what I think is a crucial part of a much larger project that is very much still in the research and writing stage, but something that is a work in progress. Something I'm trying to hopefully complete into a book project in the next year and a half or so. So perhaps I can begin by giving you some broad context by saying something about this larger project, and then I'll move on to the more specific topic that I'd like to discuss with you today. The working title of the book project is Exile in the Kingdom, the Parsi Community of India, and the Making of Modern Iranian Nationalism. And as the title suggests, the book will focus on the history of the social, cultural, and intellectual exchange that took place between the Zoroastrian Parsi community of South Asia and the community of Iranian intellectuals inside Iran during the early part of the 20th century. This exchange, so in a sense, this is really the world that I'm interested in, the Indian Ocean world and Iran's place in it, in particular the connection between Iran and India. That exchange between the Parsis and the Iranians, as I argue, served as the impetus for a revival of antiquity in Iranian culture, and helped to promote the emergence of what I and others, including my colleagues Mohammad Tavakkoli and Monica Ringer and others, have called a culture of Neo-Zoroastrianism inside Iran during the 20th century. Now, those of us who are even casually familiar with 20th century Iranian history are familiar with the ubiquitous theme of neoclassicism that permeated much of Iranian culture during the 20th century. We see this in many areas of Iranian culture during that period, in historical writing, certainly, in literature, in art, in architecture, in film, and in other areas of modern Iranian cultural history. A renewed understanding of Iran's ancient Zoroastrian religious heritage was an important part of the culture of 20th century Iranian neoclassicism. So my larger book project is an attempt to trace the cultural and intellectual genealogy of this neoclassicism. How did modern Iranians come to rediscover their classical past? What were the mechanisms that enabled this discovery? How did this discovery of this Zoroastrian heritage affect the way Iranians came to evaluate, understand, and attempt to reform their modern culture? These are some of the questions that this larger book project is trying to explore. I should state, maybe by way of background, that Zoroastrianism was, of course, the pre-Islamic religion of Iran. Until the Arab-Muslim conquest of the 7th century, the vast majority of Iranians were adherents to the Zoroastrian faith. After the 7th century conquest, most Iranians gradually converted to Islam. A small minority of Zoroastrians remained inside Iran, primarily in the city of Yazd and Kerman on the Central Plateau, and enjoyed protected legal status within the context of Islamic law. However, another segment of the Iranian Zoroastrian community emigrated from Iran and migrated to South Asia, sometime between the 7th and 10th centuries, where they became known by the ethnonym Parsi, after the Pars or Fars region of the Iranian plateau, from which they came. Ultimately, the Parsi community came to be concentrated in Western India, in the Gujarat and Sindh provinces, and most significantly in the city of Bombay. In the centuries that followed this medieval exodus to India, contact between Zoroastrians in Iran and India gradually declined. By the 19th century, however, something very important happened. Beginning in the mid-19th century, we can identify a significant renewal of contact between the diaspora Zoroastrian Parsi community of India and the Zoroastrian community inside Iran, as well as with the broader community of Iranian intellectuals inside Iran as well. This renewed contact worked to remind Iranians of their pre-Islamic culture, and ultimately led to the revival of Zoroastrianism, or Zoroastrian culture broadly, in 20th century Iran. It is this revival that eventually came to serve as the ideological basis of the official nationalism of Iran's Pahlavi monarchy during the 5+ decades of its rule. So this book project is broadly interested in tracing this cultural and intellectual genealogy of Neo-Zoroastrianism and the revival of antiquity in modern Iranian cultural history against the backdrop of a particular political history as well. And I'll say that in this project, the politics is very much in the background, and what I'm really more interested in is the cultural and intellectual history that predates the later political history that maybe we're more familiar with. In researching this more complex genealogy, I came to realize, in a very important sense, the origins of Iranian neoclassicism had its roots in the connected history of Iran and India. Or what I like to call the cultural traffic across the Indian Ocean during the late 19th and early 20th century. To tell the story of modern Iranian cultural and intellectual history, one has to go, as I've discovered, to India, and to the city of Bombay in particular. And here I'm building on the work of Niall Green, especially, and others, to think about the cultural implications of new economic connections made possible by expanding oceanic travel across the Indian Ocean, especially expanded travel made possible by steam-powered navigation. It was this cultural traffic connecting Iran and India that, as I argue, helped to foster a particular form of cultural renaissance in Iran, what I'm describing as the revival of Iranian antiquity and the culture of 20th century Iranian Neo-Zoroastrianism. Within this broader context, what I'd like to describe for you today is one small but I think crucial element in the history of cultural traffic between Iran and India, and that is the social, economic, and technical mechanisms that enabled the circulation of books. Books circulating between India and Iran during the early 20th century. In the most literal sense, this is what I mean by the idea of cultural traffic, the traffic of books, or what I'm calling books from Bombay. that found their way to Iran during the early 20th century from India and from Bombay more particularly. As I argue in the larger project, it was the circulation of modern printed materials and the emergence of certain modern institutions that facilitated the circulation of books across the Indian Ocean that served as the key material element in the cultural history that I'm interested in. More specifically, the institution that I'd like to describe for you in a little bit of detail today that I think had the most crucial role is the appearance of the modern bookstore in Tehran. It was through the circulation of printed materials produced originally in India and in Bombay in particular, books produced by Zoroastrian publishers and Zoroastrian philanthropic organizations, and subsequently exported to Iran and sold in Iran's new bookstores, that Iranian intellectuals came to acquire a renewed awareness of their pre-Islamic Zoroastrian cultural heritage. The history of bookstores in Tehran, and the history of Tehran's print marketplace, and the history of print culture in Iran more broadly can therefore tell us a great deal about Iran's social history, its economic history, its cultural history, its literary history, its urban history, the history of technology, specifically print technology, and the implication of all of these things for the emergence of new understandings of history, culture, and identity in 20th century Iran. So the specific questions that I'm interested in, as I say, are how can we trace the origins of this? How did an emerging marketplace of books affect Iran's cultural identity? And perhaps most importantly, how did the 20th century vogue of Iranian Neo-Zoroastrianism emerge out of this marketplace of print? These are the questions that I'm interested in, and let me describe for you at least a small part of this history. And I think this process unfolded in several phases, so let me try to describe for you the first of, I think, 3 phases. And it begins with technology and the history of technology. As other scholars, such as Niall Green, Ulrich Marzoff, Ulrich Stark, and Shahla Babazadeh, and others have argued, the commercialization of print in the Persianate world went hand in hand with the introduction of lithography in Iran and India. Lithography, of course, is a printing process that applies grease, water, and ink onto a flat stone surface and then presses paper onto stone to produce a printed image. At least that's the old days. Now we have digital things. It was originally invented, at least in this form, in Germany in the end of the 18th century. Lithography entered into Iran, most likely via Russia and Tabriz in the 1820s, and became widespread by the second half of the 19th century. Here's some images of Iranian lithographers at work. Like this image. This is, of course, what we call the chapesangi, right, which means literally stone printing. The introduction of lithography produced a number of important social and cultural effects in the history of Iran's print culture. Broadly speaking, the capacity of lithography to produce larger print runs, ranging into the hundreds of copies of a given work, and that's probably the largest print run that we can assume, certainly not into the thousands. But this gradually worked to redefine the nature and definition of books and the relationship between producers and consumers of printed materials. Perhaps most significantly, the more traditional personalized relationship between the textual patron and the artist scribe eroded in favor of a new system of textual commodification. Lithography, we can say, helped to mark a period of transition of books as manuscripts or as works of art to books as merchandise or as commodities that could be consumed. Manuscript tradition, and here's I like this picture. This hangs in my home office, this image. This is a a Qajar nobleman's personal home library. Books were no longer required to be reproduced individually by hand, as in the older manuscript tradition, when only small numbers of elites could afford them. The social effect of lithography unfolded gradually during the course of the 19th century, but nevertheless was important for the later emergence of bookstores in 20th century Iran. Significantly, as the commodification of books grew over the course of the 19th century, locations where inventories of lithographed books were kept became increasingly visible in urban centers such as Tehran. By the time of the 1905 Iranian constitutional revolution, Tehran's book market had in fact acquired a discernible form, as is detailed in a wide range of source material, including general histories, personal memoirs, and family histories of merchants, which is what I based a lot of this research on. By 1905, Tehran's booksellers, we can identify, were clustered together within the specialized corridors of the Tehran Bazaar, located on the northern edge of the Bazaar complex, in the passageway linking the Jame Mosque and the Masjid-e-Shah. Let me show you a few maps to give you a sense of the urban geography of the Tehran Bazaar. And here's the Bazaar region here. This is Tehran, I guess, in the mid-19th century. There is the Qajar compound. This is, of course, the Bazaar zone here. This, by the way, gives you a sense of the scale of how much Tehran has grown since the mid-19th century. This image here is this square box here. Here's a street map of the bazaar that you can find on the streets of Tehran today, and this is the zone here that I'm describing for you. This was the book bazaar location there. In particular, if I can orient myself here, right in this area here. In addition, this area of the bazaar complex was referred to by a number of names, most commonly the Bain al-Haramain Bazaar, or the market between the two shrines. In addition to this passageway, there was also an additional site of booksellers within the bazaar complex, located in the vestibule adjacent to the Masjid-e-Shah, known as the Timche Hajib-e-Dolle, which was constructed during the reign of Nasruddin Shah in the 1870s. And that's what it looks like today. I don't think they're selling books there now, but if you can imagine booksellers in here, that's the Timche. Significantly, these areas of the bazaar were also the locations of the paper and stationery merchants, the sellers of other writing materials such as ink, pens, and pencils, as well as the location of craftsmen who specialized in bookbinding, as well as tinsmiths and coppersmiths, who produced various other sorts of small-scale handicrafts. Tin and copper were the most commonly used materials for those kinds of early craft industry. The physical proximity of the booksellers to the craftsmen and artisans worked to situate the emerging lithograph print economy into the larger commercial system of the bazaar complex as a whole. So the earliest booksellers in the Tehran Bazaar were very much closely connected to the communities of merchants and artisans. Among the booksellers who pioneered this growing commercialization of lithography were, in fact, merchants who originally specialized in the medium and long-distance trade of other commodities sold in the bazaar, for example, textiles, sugar, and tea. Among these early 19th century booksellers were merchants such as Haji Mirza Tajir Kashani and his sons, who were among the first to make this important transition of working as merchants in the caravan trade, linking their native city of Kashan to the Qajar capital of Tehran, to their subsequent careers as printers and booksellers in the commercial economy of Tehran's book bazaar. Haji Mirza Kashani's sons became fixtures in Tehran's book bazaar during the late Nasruddin Shah period, 1880s, 1890s. And they were instrumental in bringing their experience as merchants of long-distance commodities to the expanding business of print. Other important late 19th and early 20th century figures in the Tehran book bazaar were members of the Furuhmand, Taraghi, and Khansari merchant families. In the case of the important Khansari family, it was Haj Muhammad Mehdi Kitab Furush Khansari, great name, right? Who was the founder of this multi-generational dynasty of printers and booksellers. This branch of the Khansari book merchant family made their way to Tehran by way of the provinces, in this case from their ancestral hometown, the small town of Khansar, north and west of Esfahan. Anyone from Khansari? Oh, good. Oh, very good. I'm glad to hear it. And so they made their way to Tehran and soon established themselves as successful lithographers and merchants of books in the Tehran book bazaar. The Khansaris were really pioneers of this, actually, the town of Khansar. Now, I don't want to burden you with too much with family names and family histories, although for me it's actually really fascinating. But I include the family histories to demonstrate that some of these families grew to become very successful and influential, and in fact became respected and prominent leaders of their communities. Printers and booksellers were in fact among the leaders of the 1905 Iranian constitutional revolution. And you can't help but think of the parallels between Iranian history and American history. Of course, in American history, some of the founders of the American Republic were printers, like Benjamin Franklin. And in Iranian history, interestingly, there's a parallel there. The best example of this in the Iranian context is Mirza Mahmud Khansari Kitab Furush, another great name. He was an early, successful bookseller in the bazaar who eventually became the leader of Tehran's Printers Guild. And he was, in fact, elected as a member of the first Iranian Majlis in 1905, 1906. So maybe he's the Iranian Benjamin Franklin, if we can say that. In fact, when we think of the membership of the first Iranian Majlis, we might think of the members including liberal nobility, progressive-minded clerics, merchants, and intellectuals. But it's also important to remember that another important group in the first Majlis were printers and booksellers. So there was a growing civic-mindedness, we might say, among the booksellers. This civic-mindedness can be said to have grown out of an increased awareness of who their customers were and what commercial tastes the print consumers consisted of, what they wanted. Among the important innovations produced or introduced by these Tehran-based print entrepreneurs was the use of lithography to produce books that would appeal to broader audiences, books that would sell. Lithography, we might say, enabled and encouraged print entrepreneurs to find new and wider audiences for their print merchandise. Among the earliest of these new commercially conceived books were new lithographed editions of traditional religious books, books that were more affordable and accessible, produced in a more mass-produced format, but still traditional religious books. These were books that could be described as chapbooks that were part of traditional mourning practices. Show you a couple. These early commercial books could also be described as illustrated hagiographic works, books that would tell and retell the legends of the lives of the great martyrs of Shi'ism. But were now told in a more popular format, in more accessible lithographed formats. In other cases, books were also increasingly purchased by individual readers for the purpose of personal entertainment, including anthologies of poetry, romances, and narrative works like the Shahnameh, the Iskandarnameh, the legend of Amir Arsalan, the Arabian Nights stories, or satirical or jocular literature such as Obeid Zakani's Mushogorbe, or the stories of Mullah Nasruddin, and many other works that might be called the beginning of a kind of popular literature. Some more. Really beautifully lithographed 1889 edition of the Shahnameh. The accessible formats of many of these books might also be compared to graphic novels or comic books. I kind of think of them that way. All of these books appeared in multiple lithographed editions over the course of the 19th century and clearly had a growing circulation. Given the low level of literacy, at the end of the 19th century, the potential marketplace for these books undoubtedly remained small. However, the precedent of producing lithographed print inventory with the expectation of future sales in the marketplace of books was part of a larger transformation towards the commodification and commercialization of print, and was a precursor to the emergence of later 20th century bookstores. Here's actually an image I found of a bookstore in the bazaar. Another kiosk. You can see he's selling, those are lithographed books there. Where did I put mine? Kiosk. I think this is in the Timche Hajibedole. And you can see some of these in libraries, and that's what they looked like when they were sold initially. Let me say something about what we might call the second phase in the history of print culture that I'm trying to think about here. If by the beginning of the 20th century we can already identify a significant transformation in Tehran's print culture along the lines of an emerging print marketplace, as I've described, then this expansion and commercialization of the world of print would become even more significant during the 1920s and 1930s as part of a period of rapid urban expansion in Tehran. And this is the second phase. The urban transformation of Tehran was significant during the 1920s and 30s as part of the modernizing initiatives of Reza Shah. As the urban landscape of Tehran became modernized, so too did the city's print marketplace. The urban expansion of print took place initially on a street in Tehran that would become the publishing center of Iran's 20th century print economy. Anybody know the name of the street? Nasser Khosrow Street. Maybe that one too. There it is. There's central Tehran. Here's Nasser Khosrow Street in probably the 1930s, I think, this photo. We can actually quantify this urban expansion of the print economy by comparing two sets of data, and I was very happy to come across this data. One collected in 1927, and the other collected in 1939. This data comes from statistical almanacs that were kept by Tehran's municipal authorities. According to the 1927 almanac, there were a total of 48 commercial spaces that could be described as bookstores in Tehran. The data also gives us details about the location of the bookstores, listing 29 booksellers who sold books within the bazaar and 19 bookstores located in commercial districts outside of the bazaar, like on Nasser Khosrow Street and maybe later Lalezar Street would be another one. Of the bookstores located outside the bazaar, 15 were clustered together on Nasser Khosrow Street, and the others were located in other newer commercial spaces in central Tehran. This urban mapping of print commerce corresponds with the beginning of a more general commercialization of urban life in central Tehran and the creation of new pedestrian zones outside of the bazaar, zones that were part of a new culture related to modern shopping that were also developing during this period. You know, the introduction of modern cafes, movie theaters, restaurants. All of this followed a similar pattern, and bookstores were part of this new culture of this period. The statistical data from 1939 suggests an acceleration of this process. The data lists only 10 places within the bazaar that continue to sell books. So there's a migration out of the bazaar into the city. By contrast, the number of bookstores listed as operating outside of the bazaar indicates a significant growth by 1939, with a total of 31 bookstores now operating in the new streets and commercial zones of the city. Perhaps most significantly, all of these new shopping zones catered to a growing social strata consisting of Tehran's newly modernized, literate, urban middle classes. And by the 1920s and 30s, we can sort of begin to identify a new middle-class culture in that respect. These changes in the demographics of bookstores may obscure an important element of continuity in the world of Tehran's print culture as well. A closer look at the histories of particular bookstores suggests that among the most important bookstore owners during the 1930s were those who had by this time inherited several generations of accumulated experience in Tehran's print economy. We can identify a number of important cases in which the son of a successful bookseller from the Tehran Bazaar continued the family tradition by establishing a modern bookstore in one of these new commercial zones of the city. Among the examples of this phenomenon is the case of Muhammad Ali Taraghi. And you see him on the left there. And those are his dates. Yeah, it's Muhammad Ali Taraghi. The founder of Kitabkhane Khayyam. Anyone ever go to Kitabkhane Khayyam? A bookstore that would become a key institution in Iran's 20th century print economy. Muhammad Ali Taraghi was born in 1894. This is his son, by the way. This is Bijan Taraghi, which might be even more familiar to some of you. He was a poet, a bookseller, a lyricist for popular music. He had a radio show in the 50s and 60s. I mean, I wasn't there. I didn't hear it, but maybe you did. He just died in 2009, the boy here. And he wrote a memoir of his life and his father's life that was very useful for this project, which I read very closely, great interest. But Muhammad Ali Taraghi was born in 1894 and was the son of a successful book merchant and lithographer in Tehran's bazaar. It was the younger Taraghi who in 1916 conceived the idea to leave the bazaar and to establish the Khayyam bookstore on Nasir Khosrow Street. The history of the Khavar bookstore followed a similar pattern. The founder of this store was Muhammad Ramazani, one of the four sons of Mirza Ali Asghar Kitab Furush, a successful 19th century printer and seller of lithographed books. It was Mirza Ali Asghar's son, Muhammad, who adopted the family name Ramazani and went on to establish the Khavar bookstore on Lalezar Street. The other key figure whose career marked this transition from the print economy of the bazaar to the world of commercialized print was Muhammad Ali Elmi. He is from this great dynasty. Like the Taraghi and Ramazani families, the Elmis were likewise originally active in the production, trade, and sale of manuscripts and lithographed works in the Tehran Bazaar. By the 1920s, it was the youngest son of the family, Muhammad Ali, there you see him, who adopted the family name Elmi and extended the family business to become one of the most successful booksellers in Iran's 20th century publishing history, establishing the Kitabkhane Elmi on Nasir Khosrow Street, as well as numerous other print enterprises, including what becomes the Ibn Sina Press, a major Iranian publishing house by the mid-century. You know, when I see these books in the library and you see who the publishers were, there's certain publishers and names that always come back, and Ibn Sina and these names, that was part of the origins of this project. Who were these publishers? And I was happy to be able to figure it out just to some extent. These three families the Taraghi, Ramazani, and Elmi families, and the bookstores and publishing houses that they founded are only three examples of a much larger trend. But they help to illustrate a new phase in the commercialization of Iran's print economy during the 1920s and 1930s. All of these families had their roots in Tehran's 19th century book bazaar and had participated in the earlier process of commercializing print during the transition from the manuscript to the lithograph tradition within the bazaar economy. It was the descendants of these same families that now played a key role in the transition from lithography to the expansion of the print economy beyond the bazaar, from the 1920s to the middle decades of the 20th century. Given this history, by the 1940s, or the typical street scene by the 40s, we can describe a reasonably mature marketplace of print in Tehran, with bookstores now well established as important social and cultural institutions in the capital city's urban landscape. Now, let me try to discuss what I would say is the final phase of this story. And here, I want to return to the story of the connection between Iran and India and the role of the Parsi community of Bombay, and the role that they played in the history of cultural traffic between the two countries, and how ultimately this worked to promote a culture of Neo-Zoroastrianism inside Iran. As the infrastructure of the print marketplace grew in Tehran, the chief entrepreneurs of Tehran's bookstores all began to travel in search of inventory. All of the key figures that I've mentioned as being pioneers in Iran's print marketplace in the 20s and 30s, Muhammad Ali Taraghi, Muhammad Ramazani, Muhammad Ali Elmi, all of these figures became aware of the new possibilities of commercialized book production during their periodic travels outside of Iran, in particular to centers of Persian language book production in India. The growing supply of Persian language books published in places like Lahore, Lucknow, Calcutta, and especially Bombay made a significant impression on these Tehran-based print entrepreneurs. The modernization and industrialization of print technology had accelerated even more rapidly in India compared to Iran during the 19th century and early 20th century. And for this reason, journeys to the subcontinent in search of print inventory became a regular part of their commercial efforts. The Persian language, of course, had a long history in India, both as a vernacular language and as a literary language. And as the technology of book production grew throughout India, the supply of Persian language books in South Asia likewise grew. Muhammad Ali Taraghi and Muhammad Ramazani in particular traveled together on numerous occasions via steamship from the port of Bushehr in southern Iran to Bombay in search of inventory for their bookstores. Once in Bombay, they also encountered a substantial expatriate Iranian community that had grown since the mid-19th century. Bombay was, in many ways, a great metropolis with an Iranian community living in it. And when we know those, how that is, the diaspora community in Bombay, like the diaspora community in Los Angeles or Seattle. Some of these expatriate Iranians residing in Bombay, in fact, worked as commercial intermediaries in the book trade between Iran and India. And one such figure is Ardashir Khazeh, an Iranian Zoroastrian poet from the city of Yazd, who had settled in Bombay in the 1920s and established a Persian language bookstore there. And his bookstore was apparently there. He died in 1987, and until the 1980s, his bookstore was still there. When I was doing some research in Bombay, some of my Parsi friends in Bombay remembered him as living in Bombay during this period. The book, and he also wrote a memoir, an autobiography that's also very useful. The books that Tehran's print entrepreneurs encountered during their visits to Bombay were different in several ways from the more traditional inventories of books found in the Tehran Book Bazaar. First, The Bombay books had a higher production value due to their typographical print, their industrialized forms of binding, and their inclusion of other elements of modern book production, such as tables of contents, indexes, and by the 1920s and 1930s, photographs. Second, the Bombay books also included many works of Persian literature that had traditionally only circulated within the Persian literary traditions of South Asia. These South Asian Persian language literary works had distinctive literary styles that were in some cases unfamiliar or unknown inside Iran. The growing orientation of the book trade towards India therefore opened up new possibilities, not only in terms of production techniques, but also in terms of literary style. This ultimately relates to the most important aspect of the opening up of Tehran's market to the Bombay books. The Persian inventory of books found in Bombay were also different, not only in terms of production value or literary style, but also subject matter. Among the new subjects discovered by the Tehrani book entrepreneurs in Bombay were books on the subject of Zoroastrianism and the history of pre-Islamic Iran. From the mid-1920s, Zoroastrian publishing houses in Bombay began producing books intended for the marketplace of readers in Iran. Two Zoroastrian philanthropic organizations in Bombay, in particular, were the most responsible for publishing a steady supply of books written in Persian and intended for export to the reading public in Iran. These organizations were the Bombay-based Iran League and the Iranian Zoroastrian Anjuman. Here's a photograph of the Iran League from 1925, or some of the members of the Iran League in 1925. The principal member of both of these organizations was a civic-minded, Bombay-born Parsi philanthropist named Dinshaw Irani, who served as the founding president of both of these organizations. And here he is, one of the great patrons of this effort. Dinshaw Irani was among the chief architects of the charity, publishing, philanthropic efforts of the Bombay-based Iran League and the Iranian Zoroastrian Anjuman. Both of these organizations collected substantial funds from the prosperous Zoroastrian community of Bombay, a community that had acquired great wealth during the 19th century as a result of trade and industrialization policies of the British Raj. Bombay-based Parsi patrons and benefactors were generous and developed a great interest in what they considered to be their ancestral homeland of Iran. Among their efforts in reaching out to their Iranian compatriots were charity and philanthropic efforts in the form of establishing hospitals, schools, orphanages inside Iran, particularly in the Zoroastrian centers of Yazd and Kerman. But the Parsi philanthropists were also involved in the publishing industry. Among the things that they published was the Iran League Quarterly from 1930 onwards. It was a bilingual community magazine in English and Persian that circulated both in Western India, Bombay, and in Iran. Between 1924 and 1940, the Iran League was also involved in the publication of dozens of books on Zoroastrian themes, books that were published in Bombay, in Persian, and which found their way onto the shelves of Tehran's bookstores. The infrastructure of textual traffic between Iran and India was by this point well established. Among the books that found their way from Bombay to Tehran were Zoroastrian-themed books of general interest, books that were intended for wide audiences, such as the Iran Shah Tarikh Muhajirat Zartushtian be Hindustan, the history of the migration of the Zoroastrians to India, which is a short book, maybe 100 pages, really a kind of pamphlet. It was perhaps the first book written in modern Persian that sort of told the story of the Parsi migration to India in a very easily understandable format. Other books that were written explicitly for the reading public in Iran during this period included the Akhlaq-e-Iran Bastan and the Falsafe-e-Iran Bastan, other short little books about ancient Iranian religion or ancient Iranian beliefs, ideas. But the most significant and important book of all was the publication in 1927 of the first modern Persian translation of the Zoroastrian sacred texts, the Gathas. The translation from the original Avestan into modern Persian was made by the great Iranian scholar Ibrahim Pur-Davud. Really the first modern Iranian to learn the Avestan language. Pur-Davud, and there he is. That's a young Ibrahim Pur-Davud. Maybe some of you might know him when he was older. But this is Ibrahim Pur-Davud, 1924. There's Din Shah Irani, and you can see he's actually standing in front of a steamship. This is when he arrived in Bombay, and he was greeted with flowers by the Parsi benefactors. And this gentleman here is Peshtonji Markar, who was the greatest benefactor of all, who financed this whole publishing translation effort, was really through the Markar funds. And I think he was in the cotton textile business. Pur-Davud was recruited by members of the Parsi community of Bombay to translate the Gathas. He collaborated closely with his Zoroastrian patrons in Bombay, and the publication of the translation was ultimately sponsored via the financial support of the Iran League. The importance of Pur-Davud's translation is difficult to overestimate, as it gave modern Iranians their first textual encounter with Iran's pre-Islamic history and with its Zoroastrian heritage in the form of the modern Persian literary language, a language which they were familiar with. Pur-Davud's translation of the Gathas, as well as his many other publications, and the larger genre of Neo-Zoroastrian popular books published by multiple authors, circulated widely in Iran by the middle decades of the 20th century. These books were especially popular among a reading public consisting of Iran's growing middle class, a middle class that was also very much a part of the growing marketplace of books in Tehran. Now, let me just try to conclude with one final idea. Ultimately, what the story of the textual traffic between Iran and India illustrates is the relationship between technological changes ushered in by print and the social and cultural consequences that emerged as a result of these changes. The emergence of a modern marketplace of books and the economic connections that came to link Iran and India together by the early 20th century had the effect of producing new understandings of Iranian history and culture and identity, and new possibilities of cultural change. In particular, print allowed for new connections between economies, societies, and cultures, and it allowed for the emergence of experimental new forms of cultural syncretism within this Indian Ocean world. The new Iranian-Indian transnational print economy and the books from Bombay allowed for forgotten, suppressed, or disregarded aspects of Iran's cultural heritage to be re-empowered via the technology of print and the growing marketplace of books. The emergence of the modern print economy allowed for the possibility that these new or newly revived forms of culture might find reading publics. So the story of Iranian Neo-Zoroastrianism and the cultural revival of Iranian antiquity was one of these new syncretic cultural movements to emerge out of the possibilities engendered by this marketplace of books. And ultimately, Iranian Neo-Zoroastrianism was a culture that grew out of the social and cultural connections of India and Iran. New connections that were made possible by globalizing trends of the early 20th century. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Sure. We have time for questions. Marashi has agreed.
Please, we'd love to try to answer your questions. If you have any stories from the old bookstores, please tell me. I'd love to hear the old story. بفرمایید. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely part of the cultural and political context. You can see how the culture of this Neo-Zoroastrianism very much ties into the political project of the Pahlavi monarchy and the Reza Shah period in particular. You know, Din Shah Irani and all of these guys were welcomed in Iran in the court, and they traveled to Iran and met with Reza Shah and so forth. So that's very much part of this story. Yeah, I mean, the Russian, I mean, I'm sure this is going to come up, and maybe there's other connections to be made. But definitely, I mean, the connections of Iran to the north and to the west, to the Ottoman context, to the Russian context, those are also very important cultural connections, and the print economy in those directions is also a very important part of the story. But I think the role of the Parsi community in the context of this particular revival of antiquity really played an important part. I mean, in the Russian context of things, some of that pre-Islamic cultural heritage was influenced by ideas, someone like Akhundzadeh, Fatali Akhundzadeh, who lived in the Caucasus, very much influenced and inspired by Russian Orientalism, Russian ideas of Iranian history. That's a 19th century phenomenon, and maybe there were others. But I think in the 20th century, in the 1920s and 30s in particular, it's this Parsi cultural revival that I think is the most important one for that era, I would say. Okay, this is another very good question, and this is one of the things that I didn't really talk about in the presentation, but in the written form I say a little bit more about it. Obviously it's very low, but this is another social change that's happening. I mean, the estimates that we have for literacy at the beginning of the 20th century, single digits. Single digit, certainly, maybe less than 5%. But it's also during this period of the 1920s and 30s, and this goes back to my first book, is when the institution of a national education system was established, a system of national schools. So we see from this period, the 20s and 30s, that literacy is growing, and especially in urban centers and especially in Tehran. Now, it's difficult to estimate what the literacy rate was in Tehran, say by 1940. But I would not be surprised that a third of the population might have pretty good literacy, because it would attract the literate, and the schools were developing. Certainly a majority, mass literacy is something that happens in the second half of the 20th century. But already by the 1920s and 30s and 40s, there's a social base for this marketplace of print. So that's, I think, another important part of this. And then the question becomes, what books do these people want to read? And that's sort of another part of the story. And I think in some ways, this vogue of Neo-Zoroastrianism grows out of this social change and cultural change. Yes, I'm not sure if it comes up in those sources, but it's very easy to trace the number of editions of books. And some of these popular books, like the Akhlaq-i Iran-Bastan and the Falsafe Iran-Bastan, you can see them going through numerous editions during the 20s and 30s. So there is a kind of, measure of that. And the sheer number of books, someone like Purdavud, wrote many books, so he had a readership. That's, yeah, but in the memoirs themselves, I can't think if that specific issue comes up. And we can go back, I think we had our hand, then we'll come down here, please. Good question. I'm not sure if I know enough about that. I mean, definitely, one change that happens, as I mentioned, when you go from the manuscript tradition to the lithographed edition, the visual style of the graphics changes very dramatically. But in the 20s and 30s, the transition that I'm sort of trying to really focus on is the transition from lithography to typography. And in that context, the graphics change entirely again and really become much less important, I would say, in the typographic tradition. Some basic design. In some sense, I mean, this is another measure of the decline of publishing as a work of art, because in the manuscript tradition, that's when we have the great manuscript artists. By the time we get to typography, I'm not sure if that's sort of valued in the same way. So that's something else that's lost, including this tradition of graphic artists. But it probably comes back again later in a new form. Someone had a hand up, yes. Back up. Yes, I mean, it's, this is a good question for you, but I think maybe part of the answer is oral tradition. I mean, this is another very important thing. Most people didn't read books. Most people would hear books. Books would be, of course, in the tradition of literature and Persian poetry, poetry was experienced collectively as in performance. And so that's another part of this story that I'm trying to think about, is how customs of reading change. And this has been the work of Benjamin Fortna in Turkish studies, has written about how we read, and cultures of reading change. The idea of a person sitting and reading quietly, that was very uncommon before the 20th century. And yes, all of this tradition of classical Persian poetry was always something that was, or to a large extent, except for the literary, the elite, was always something that was experienced in collective performance formats. I mean, I think that's the way I would try to answer that question. Back. Yes, sir. Yeah, you. Yes, I think so. I mean, in my first book, the way I describe this is purely as an intellectual development, as Iranian intellectuals who learn about ideas of culture and history, usually from European sources. And the vogue of neoclassicism was, of course, very much part of the mainstream of 19th century European historical thought. And that's another sort of, I would say, maybe even primary way in which ideas of neoclassicism were first encountered. But what I'm trying to do with this project is to look sort of beyond the intellectual history in the sort of conventional sense to try to trace the material and social environment. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do. But what you're describing, I think, is definitely part of the story. And neoclassicism was a much wider phenomenon in the 19th century and 20th century in general. So yeah, any Iranian that had an intellectual engagement with modern European forms of thought would have been aware of neoclassicism. Over here, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, that's another good question. I mean, part of the answer to that, I think, is, we really have to appreciate, you might say, the sophistication of the Bombay Parsis. The community of Parsis in Bombay by the 19th century, end of the 19th century, were very modernized, educated, well-developed. I don't think we could say that about the Zoroastrian community of Kerman and Yazd, that they were on really hard times in that period. And that's part of the reason why the Parsis were engaged in philanthropic efforts to build schools and hospitals, because really and I can't speak with too much authority on this, but that kind of foundation for a kind of intellectual tradition was just stronger in Bombay than it was even in Kerman and Yazd. So that's, I think, how I would try to answer that question. Well, yeah, I mean, I haven't thought too much about that. It comes up only in the broadest sense, but definitely, I think, from the context of the colonial state in India, the British were supportive of what the Parsis were doing. Although I have to say that from the point of view of the Pahlavi state in the 20s and 30s, I mean, it was unclear how the politics were going to evolve. I mean, obviously, of course, neoclassicism can take all sorts of political forms. And there were trends within neoclassicism, within Iranian nationalist movement, the intellectual community in the 20s and 30s, that could be described as fascist, anti-British. And we sometimes think of Iranian nationalism in its later form as being pro-Western, pro-American. But in the 20s and 30s, I mean, this is one of the things I've discovered here, is that it was, the Parsis had their own agenda, and it was unclear what the Iranian nationalist movement in Iran, what their agenda was going to be with neoclassicism. So that's what I would say. I think, I mean, I would say a couple of things. One is that, from the mid-19th century, there was a growing movement of migration from Iran to Bombay in particular. So the scale of things was something very different. I mean, this expatriate community of Iranians in Bombay that I described, that was something new. That was something very, very different. The other thing that I would say is new is, and this would require looking a little bit more into the content of these ideas, which I haven't really done in this paper, and my colleague Monica Ringer has actually done more of this, is that there was an effort to reinterpret Zoroastrianism. It wasn't just reviving Zoroastrianism, but it was a certain form of Zoroastrianism. It was a Zoroastrianism that the Parsis had themselves intellectually created over a much longer period that became a kind of more universalist, monotheistic form of religion than maybe Zoroastrianism had been in the pre-modern period. It was a form of Zoroastrianism that was very much a kind of a surrogate Protestantism. It supported the liberal values of the modern commercial economy, hard work and those kinds of things. And so I think that was part of what was new as well. But Monica Ringer's work on this is, I think, the stronger statement than I can make. Yeah. I don't know all the details of that. Obviously, there are other great print traditions in other parts of the Middle East. Certainly, in Istanbul and Cairo and Beirut, these were also all major centers of print in this period. And there was all the transitions, the changes that I'm describing from manuscript to lithography to typography, all of these things were happening in other parts of the region as well. So this is really part of a larger trend towards the evolution of manuscripts and books, how books came to be as we see them today, or I guess not so much today because now everything's on an iPad. So there's something wistfully nostalgic about how books became books in the old sense. But yeah, I don't think there's anything exceptional or unique about what I'm describing in Iran, but other than the particular, this is one difference. In Persian, there is a closeness between the way the language is spoken and the written language, and that distance is closer than in, say, Arabic, with classical Arabic, and then there's all the vernacular forms. So in some ways it was, I think, and I don't want to make the argument of Iranian exceptionalism, because that goes against my whole philosophy of history, but I think it was in some ways maybe easier to produce a mass reading public within the Persian linguistic zone, because the spoken language and the written language were closer. So I think that's maybe one thing that might be somewhat different. But I wouldn't emphasize that, especially to my other friends. Yes, Bafama. Oh, yeah. I think one is the continuation of the other. The 19th century tradition, someone like Akhundzadeh or Kermani, most of their writing circulated within a group of their friends, their correspondence. All of these great works of 19th century Iranian neoclassicism that we're familiar with, that my first book I write about, Akhundzadeh, Mirza Agha Khan Kermani, they circulated among very few people. I mean, they were letters that they would write to each other. In the 20th century, the story that I'm trying to tell is, yes, this is those ideas that began in the 19th century now have a kind of social force because of these changes of a marketplace of books, of ideas, that now it's not just elite intellectuals telling these stories to each other. Now there is a population who can choose what they want to read. Exactly, exactly. One other. Okay. Yes. Okay, that's another very good question. And as you can see in this presentation, I focused on Tehran. Uh, and you could make the argument I'm too Tehran-centric. I was born in Tehran, but no, certainly there were other important centers of print commerce, of print production, of circulation, of trade and reading, other places as well. Certainly Shiraz, there was a great book about print culture in Shiraz that came out a couple years ago. Mashhad, Tabriz, we talked a little bit about Tabriz. But I think the scale of things was bigger in Tehran because of the social changes were more accelerated there. And I don't know, maybe I am too Tehran-centered, but but in any case, yeah, I think all of that happened elsewhere, but it took longer to get to other places. But thank you,
very
thank you,
much,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Before moving to the Walker Ames room, there will be a short announcement by one of the wonderful members of this wonderful community, Katia Geller. Katia, please. I think about a sister cities project. Why isn't it brother cities?
Because sister cities are better. I know you're all kind of tired and you've been listening to a lot of deep information. Mine is not so meaty, but I don't know if all of you know about the Seattle-Isfahan Sister City effort that we are trying to undertake. I think probably a lot of you are thinking, why on earth would you be doing that right now? And I want to tell you that this follows a tradition of sister cities that have taken place under the most dire circumstances, one of which was here in Seattle during the Soviet era, and it was between Tashkent and Seattle. And it was a very successful sister city effort that was undertaken by a group called Plowshares and a bunch of citizens of this town. And they actually chipped away at the wall, and they were instrumental in bringing about change. And travel was extremely difficult then. The circumstances were very difficult. And so they met with great success. There were about 180 US citizens who took it upon themselves to travel to the Soviet Union, to Tashkent. They did joint projects in Africa, volunteer projects together. So they managed to make things work. So we believe very strongly that we're going to press ahead with our effort, and we're going to try and be a clearinghouse of ideas so that we are ready when the time comes to sign on the dotted line and make this official, that we can do it. We've already spoken with the mayor of Isfahan, the mayor's city government, everyone is on board, and Mayor Murray, who we've spoken with, is also on board, but they're waiting for each other's governments to kind of come around. In the meantime, I just want to let you know what our mission statement is. We're a non-political entity, but our work is going to be a little bit broader than just Isfahan and Seattle. It's a way of making a bridge between our two peoples. The best way to connect two countries is through a sister city relationship. There's a lot of exchange that can happen below and above political exchange. So it's a people-to-people effort, a lot of educational, academic exchange can happen. And now, with the advent of the internet, we actually have it better than Tashkent and Seattle had. So there's a lot of collaboration that we can do without traveling. So our mission statement has been, the goal of the Seattle-Isfahan Sister City Association, otherwise known as SISCA, is to build a community in Seattle to support and incubate non-political, people-to-people collaborations with Isfahan, Iran. We believe we are the first group in the U.S. to undertake this kind of effort since the revolution. Before the revolution, there were many sister city relationships between the U.S. and Iran. Right now, there are none that are active. Despite the recent drastic curtailment of travel between the U.S. and Iran and the increase in animosity between governments, we remain firmly committed to our goal. Such actions inspire us to work even harder toward our goal of building bridges between our peoples. We intend to make full use of the vast array of digital communication tools available to us for virtual collaborations with students, musicians, filmmakers, artists, performers, professional people, poets, teachers, writers, and other groups with shared interests. So we encourage you to become members. It's a $5 one-time membership fee. We are a nonprofit, and we have forms out there. We would love to hear from you about ideas that you might have that we can incubate. We've had someone approach us to have a virtual concert of classical guitar music from here and in Isfahan, so we're working on that. There are a lot of students who want to collaborate across borders, but any ideas you have, please let us know. Our information is out there. We are also putting out newsletters every once in a while when we can. It's an all-volunteer organization, so our latest copy is out there that you can flip through, and some of you, if you're already on our mailing list, you've already gotten it. We try to collaborate with the University of Washington Persian Studies program a lot. We try to be at all their events so we can answer questions and encourage people to join us. And we are actually taking a step beyond our circle and planning an event that we haven't announced yet, but it's in our newsletter now. March 19th, we're probably going to be the first Nowruz celebration taking place in a city hall endorsed by mayor. So the mayor of Seattle has agreed to host us for an event, and we're working feverishly on that right now. We have a very short window of opportunity, but we think now is the best time for our community to step into the spotlight with everything that's happening and the interest that exists in everything from the 7 countries and beyond. So we're going to undertake that, and we hope you'll all attend and be looking for a Facebook event for that. And we just want to make sure that you understand that efforts like this are not in vain, and that we would really appreciate your support. And especially, we need someone who can help us with social media. So if you know anyone, we need a volunteer in that department, a student, a professional who wants to just give. We appreciate that. I have a lot more here, but I will make it even shorter now by skipping all my notes. If you have any questions, myself and my colleague Nancy Penrose will be out there to answer your questions. We have little sheets of paper that has all our social media written down on it. Take a copy of that with you, and we hope to see you at the next UW event. Thank you.
Now you can follow me.